This content is brought to you by Uphold, which makes crypto investing easy. I've been a user of Uphold since 2017. They're one of my go-to exchanges. You can buy, sell, and trade cryptocurrencies on Uphold. You can also trade precious metals and equities. They have 10 plus million users, 250 plus cryptocurrencies, and they're available in 150 countries. As with all exchanges, you can buy and sell on them, but I highly recommend you custody your own crypto, not your keys, not your coins. If you'd like to learn more about Uphold, please visit the link in the description. Welcome back to the Thinking Crypto podcast, your home for cryptocurrency news and interviews. With me today is JW Verret, who's no stranger to the show. JW is a crypto law professor of accounting and corporate/securities law. JW was also a former member of the SEC advisory committee. JW, great to have you back on.
Good to be back on Thinking Crypto.
Yeah, man, lots to talk about. You know, I've been following you for a long time. Obviously, you talk a lot about securities law, what the SEC has been doing, and much more. Certainly want to start off with the big hot topic, which is the ruling in the SEC Ripple lawsuit, XRP being declared not a security. What were your initial thoughts hearing the ruling?
I had expected two things. I had expected that if Ripple's willing to go all the way to the Supreme Court, they have a good shot to change administrative law and the discretion agencies get through the major questions doctrine. So I still have high hopes for that long term. I also thought that the odds were tough on Ripple at the district court. I thought maybe they'd have a shot with fair notice. But I thought the odds were tough. And ultimately, what happened at the district court was a surprise to me. And it was a surprise, the extent of the win and the ramifications of that win for the broader secondary markets. I didn't expect that. That was a good surprise for those of us who are worried about the state of crypto right now. It's a really good surprise.
Yeah, and the implications are pretty huge for the entire market, right? Especially the altcoins with secondary market sales, programmatic, and so forth. Do you believe the rest of the industry can use some of Ripple's defenses and the case law here in their defenses against the SEC?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, what the ruling makes clear, and I believe this is good law, and I believe this was always the law, is that just because something is a token, a thing, a piece of computer code might be sold, or any other form of property might be sold as part of a security transaction, doesn't mean that it is itself a security. That's just basic securities law, fundamental interpretation of the Howey test. And a friend of mine, Lewis Cohen, and a few of his co-authors at DLX Law wrote a great article about this called The Ineluctable Modality of Securities Law. Kind of big words, but just Google Lewis Cohen Howey test and download that article because it's really interesting, and it has an extended metaphor of thinking through somebody selling seeds and just kind of taking you down the line of reasoning that if the sale of seeds, sale of grain is a security, and it makes the seed itself a security, then the trees become a security, and it just kind of shows you the ridiculousness of the obtuse reasoning in the SEC's filings in some of these cases. And so, the judge ruled, I think, in conformity with that line of reasoning. It doesn't mean that we're always going to win. It doesn't mean we're always going to win.
Sure.
It doesn't necessarily mean Coinbase is going to win everything. But it means we can win. It means we can win. And that wasn't even clear before, So this is that moment in battle where, you're engaged in guerrilla warfare, and all of a sudden, like the occupying force, you destroy their base and you see them retreat for once. And that hasn't happened yet. And you sort of think, I try to limit the metaphors to like some of my favorite 80s movies about rebellions, like Red Dawn. You ever saw that one, Red Dawn?
Oh, yeah,
good one. Yeah, but I feel like we're in Red Dawn. We've like blown up some Russian tanks and they're thinking about retreating. So that's kind of where we are. It doesn't mean we're going to win. We're still matched against a very well-funded and powerful opponent. But at least we won something, man. At least they're running right now, and that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. So JW, you mean the oranges I have in my kitchen, the ones that I buy in my supermarket, all the orange groves down in Florida right now those are not securities inherently?
Those are not securities. Those are not securities, man.
But
And that really matters because if you took the SEC, it's one example of how ridiculous this could get. If you took the SEC's view that just because something is sold in a security transaction, it becomes a security. If you took that view, then that means that you can't use tokens for the use cases they were created for. You can't use them as gas because that's a sale of a security, and then it has to be regulated in some way, which is ridiculous. Yeah. And that interpretation of the law would destroy these projects. Not only is it wrong historically, but it would just destroy these projects. You couldn't use these tokens on the network.
Right.
Mine them, and stake them. You couldn't do the things they're meant to do.
And the funny thing is, Bitcoin itself, while it has been viewed, and the SEC officials, past and present, have said it's not a security, it's a commodity. But Bitcoin itself can be packaged into a security if, let's say, Michael Saylor, at MicroStrategy said, the Bitcoin that we hold, I'm going to create a financial product around it and put out an offering that if you invest through MicroStrategy, we'll give you higher returns than any other Bitcoin that you hold. That could be a security.
Yeah, it might be a security because it would pass the investment contract test because of the nature of that offering. It might also be a security because they make it stock, and he creates a company, and you buy stock in his Bitcoin holding company. It could be a lot of ways to make it a security, but that doesn't make the Bitcoin itself a security, obviously.
Right. Exactly. So there are a lot of talks about appeals that the SEC could appeal, but look, Ripple could also appeal certain things the SEC won in this case. What do you think is the likelihood of an appeal, and or is this kind of a negotiating tactic for optics for settlement?
I think the SEC seems like they will appeal, and the only open question is whether or not the judge will certify the appeal for interlocutory review before the trial, or whether she'll make them wait till after the trial. Usually they tend to allow you to appeal before the trial. So I think the odds are probably that she will, but that's not certain. So we have to see what decision she makes on
that. Do you think the SEC could win if, or what are the, now this is a hard question, what are the percentages maybe of them winning versus losing?
I think the odds are against them winning on the question of, first of all, I think the judge made a good point in footnote 16 of saying, look, I'm not ruling that every secondary sale of crypto token is not a security because I don't need to make that ruling for this case. So that there's some uncertainty from this ruling, and that would make it hard to overturn it. That makes it harder to overturn it because she's not ruling any further than she needs to in the ruling. So I think that will help protect it from being overturned.
Now, you mentioned Coinbase before and how Coinbase could use this when by Ripple. In their case, look, the SEC is suing Coinbase, and Coinbase is suing SEC. The judge, I know recently I read some comments calling out the SEC for the nonsense. Essentially, you approved this company, give them an S1 to go public. Now you're trying to sue them for the things they were doing back then. What are your thoughts? Do you see Coinbase winning their lawsuit?
I think they will definitely, I could say with 100% certainty that they will win on some of the tokens that are alleged to be securities. I believe that they will win on that. And therefore, that means that there will be precedent going forward that will restrain the SEC in going after some tokens. They might lose on some tokens. They might win on all tokens on the basis of the holding in Ripple. If the judge in Coinbase decides to use the Ripple case as informative precedent, it's obviously not binding precedent, but the judge could use it as informative precedent. So they might win on the whole enchilada, but I think they will definitely win on some of the alleged tokens, either because of an analysis of the token themselves and a finding that the sale of the distribution of that token was never the distribution of a security, or on the overall finding from Ripple that just because it might have been a security at some point doesn't mean it's a security when it's listed on Coinbase. I mean, I know, for example, a lot of the stuff I buy in Coinbase, I put in my wallet and then I use it. I actually use it. I use Filecoin on IPFS. And I use some tokens through my Flexa app to buy burritos and socks at Nordstrom's and ice cream. I do it partly for fun and partly to annoy my family. And sometimes the folks at Baskin Robbins are like, "What is Flexa?" I'm like, no, you don't understand. There's a QR code. It's like a gift card. You need to, and I have to teach them how to do it, to use it at Baskin Robbins, to use but I just think it's cool to use a Uniswap token at Baskin Robbins to buy some ice cream. So yeah, I buy on Coinbase sometimes with no speculative intent at all, with the desire to use the token. And so the SEC's got a very difficult problem on their hands of trying to figure out the purpose behind which individuals are actually buying tokens on Coinbase. Coinbase has been very careful in how they communicate selling these tokens. So that's kind of where we are. I mean, and a lot of people are, for example, a lot of people in Solana are buying Solana to use it to mint NFTs. They're buying. I think for some tokens, like, it's not even something I do as a hobby. Sometimes the only reason I bought some of these tokens have been to use it, to use for gaming, to use for minting NFTs. Basically, I fundamentally do a lot of that on Coinbase. I think a lot of people do. So you combine that fact with the ruling of the Ripple case, and I think Coinbase has a strong case.
What about, I haven't seen many folks mention this, and the SEC has not declared it irrelevant, but Bill Hinman and Jay Clayton approved it as chair. They said Ethereum is not a security, and they gave the kind of pathway to that maybe at one point when it did its ICO, it was a security, but it became sufficiently decentralized. Why isn't that being used? And do you think judges can use that, or Coinbase can throw it into the mix in addition to the Ripple ruling? What are your thoughts on that? The SEC itself at one point was saying, hey, look at this asset. Here's how we view it.
Yeah. I think it is important to use degree of decentralization and indicia of decentralization to argue against application of the Howey test in particular transactions. I think that's absolutely relevant. I think that was a great interpretation of the law by the SEC's guidance on this. I think, so that's just as a matter of doctrine that confounds easy Howey application to crypto. And I think it still should. It still does. It didn't really come up as much in the Ripple case, but it still should, and it still does.
Sure.
What was interesting in the Ripple case was it wasn't so much about decentralization, but it was just a judge understanding the technology, which if judges are willing to understand the tech, then we can win. And in other crypto cases I've been involved with, that's the key, is if the judge is willing to learn about the tech, you got a good shot of winning. And the judge was willing to learn about the tech and learn about the difference between the token and the company. And the fact that the token was not equity in the company. The company, who was the defendant, issued this, and then it came out and took on a life of its own. So the judge was willing to understand the difference between the token and stock in the company. And that's great for the common enterprise element of the Howey test, and great for confounding easy application of the common element, common ownership, common interest element of the Howey test. Okay, so decentralization is also useful because it means the others and the efforts of others. It could speak to either the fourth element or the third element. Sure. It means the others are not the same others that tried to sell you the investment, right? They're very, very far removed from the others that promoted the investment. Or it could be used for the commonality element as well. So I think it's good law. The other thing going on with all of that, I don't think the Hinman emails really mattered that much for the decision. But the way the SEC in bad faith played footsie over the emails and the way that they, in bad faith, I mean, so much so that I think the judge almost sanctioned the lawyers for the SEC in that case. You could tell she was the magistrate judge, because they were taking mutually contradictory positions about the emails when it was convenient. And she saw it and she fussed at him in some of the rulings she handed down. When you see that kind of bad faith activity, it means Ty is going to go against you in a doctrinal analysis. So it probably would have been better for the SEC if they said, look, here are the emails, but an individual staffer doesn't speak for the agency, which is true. That's always been the SEC's position. They should have just given over the emails, which they ended up doing eventually, rather than this bad faith posturing. I think that hurt them. To the extent that there were interpretive questions. I think Ty goes against you when you're a bad faith actor in the litigation, and they were.
Yeah, I mean, Judge Sarah Nibbern said they lack faithful allegiance to the law. I mean, that's something for a judge to say about a government agency who's supposed to be, defending retail investors or protecting them, I should say.
Yeah, I wouldn't want that ever written about me as a practicing lawyer by a judge. That's an embarrassment.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. And, on the point of decentralization and, Hinman's speech and so forth, I think Patrick McHenry and Glenn Thompson's bill includes some of that, right? I think we're seeing bits and pieces, and I see these folks, Lummis Gillibrand, Patrick McHenry, and Glenn Thompson, they're piggybacking on this Ripple lawsuit ruling. I see them referencing it and talking about it, and using this as momentum to help get some bills through.
Yeah, my understanding is I think they've there's a third amended version of McHenry Thompson that came out this week in advance of the, or maybe it's an amendment to the version, but in any event, there's a third version now, and the new version incorporates some language from the Ripple case.
GW, hard question for you. Next year is the crazy election cycle, right?
Yeah.
You think? Look, I know they're going to get something through the House. You think the Senate can get something through this year?
Well, no. Sherrod Brown's not going to vote for anything that would ever be good for crypto. I mean, he's not. So the Senate has to change hands before that to be a possibility.
Wow. So it looks like we got maybe a couple more years before that happens.
I think so.
Well, man, I hope we don't get more enforcement actions. Maybe the wins have been taken out of Gary Gensler's sails, and knock on wood.
You could hope so. I mean, I hope tomorrow. I have to figure there's some hard conversations going on, because the SEC as a entity is more than any one chairman. That agency is 80 years old. And if you're the general counsel, if you're in the general counsel's office, they have to think about the state of securities law. And they have to think about, if we lose on a couple of alleged tokens in Coinbase, then that interpretation of how he's going to be there. And people are going to design new token offerings around that opinion. And so by getting ahead of our skis in allegations, now that we see we can lose, we thought we would just always win, so we could just allege everything as a security. Now that we see we can lose, we don't want to create more precedent that's going to hold us back at some point when we want to use the Howey test against a scammy token or something that takes off. So they have to be thinking about that and weighing that against, look, if the SEC said tomorrow, we've looked at the items in Coinbase's request for public rulemaking from last summer, where they asked some questions, some legitimate questions. We're willing to work with crypto lawyers in the crypto community, a lot of whom are SEC alumni, former SEC staff working in crypto, are big law alumni that are like legit securities lawyers that have been doing securities law stuff. Legit's the wrong word, but seen as legit by the TradFi and the SEC people. Okay. I'm willing to work with that group to design optimal disclosure path and market structure path for crypto. If they came out and do that and did that and made that clear and did it in a good faith way that they haven't been doing for the last couple of years, and you'd have hundreds of crypto token lawyers and exchange lawyers showing up at the door It would be like a Taylor Swift concert at outside F Street at the SEC's headquarters. You would not be able to get in the door of all the lawyers there to go with ideas to include in a regulatory framework that could work, that could fulfill the SEC's mission. They just have to take the first step.
The other big case that folks are watching closely is Grayscale versus the SEC over the denial of a Bitcoin spot ETF. Now, while that has been happening, all of a sudden BlackRock comes out of nowhere and says, we want a Bitcoin spot ETF. And then the whole Wall Street herd started lining up for it. What are your thoughts? And does the BlackRock move signify that it'll also help in Grayscale possibly winning this?
Yeah, it's well, first of all, I agree with the conventional wisdom among crypto lawyers that the oral argument went really well for Grayscale. Went really well for Grayscale. One of the judges on that panel, Judge Rao, was actually my former colleague. So she taught at George Mason Law School with me, and was right down the hall from me. So there was a printer, and on one side of the printer was her office, and the other side was my office. So I know her pretty well. She tends to be skeptical. It's not a secret. This was in all her writings before she was a judge. Pretty skeptical of administrative agencies. She ran a center at our law school called the Center for the Study of the Administrative State. So it wasn't a center on administrative law, but a Center for the Study of the Administrative State, which is a phrase that skeptics of it, the administrative state, tend to call it, right? So she's open to Grayscale's arguments, I think, is fair to say. And she indicated that during the oral argument. So I think they got a good shot. Now, what happens after that? It's hard for judges to nail down agencies when they're really willing to ignore the law. So maybe after that opinion, there's some speculation that maybe the SEC would just deny all Bitcoin ETFs. They can't do that forever.
Yeah.
And I like to tell people when we talk about this application, we could play a game. You could play a drinking game with 40 Act mutual fund lawyers, 40 Act lawyers, and 33 Act lawyers who deal with those types ETF lawyers, basically. Let's find the 10 most ridiculous ETFs that the SEC has approved in the past, and that have done nothing but lose money for investors since inception.
Right.
And we could probably let's see who could come up with the most. I could definitely find at least 10 of them. So how can you approve those and not approve this? After Australia's approved it, after Canada has approved it, after those countries have approved Ethereum ETFs, which is the next thing we got to fight for. Right. Germany's approved the Bitcoin ETF. How can we continue? We've got approval of futures ETFs, but not spot ETFs. I mean, how much longer can you stop it and not look like it's a naked political play? Now, you asked about BlackRock. That's interesting. I'm a BlackRock skeptic, and it's kind of weird. It's like your opponent in a lot of policy fights suddenly comes in and supports something you really like. So you wonder, how do I feel about this? I don't know. I kind of feel good to have my allies in the fight, but do I really want BlackRock and Bitcoin intermeshed? Oh, I don't know if I like that in the long term. Some people were speculating when this first happened that BlackRock, by being a big owner, could eventually, I guess, and they would have to be a miner for this to work, but could eventually try to fork the Bitcoin blockchain to something more, surveillance-y. I don't know. I don't know if that's a conspiracy theory or not, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on. And it leads me to want to keep an eye on Nakamoto coefficient in the network. Make sure that these big TradFi players don't get too much power for the Bitcoin blockchain. So those are two things to work out for. But I think your intuition's absolutely right that BlackRock getting involved, given that BlackRock is such a huge player in Democrat politics, and given that Gary Gensler's fine-tuned to Democrat politics, like an analyst on CNN almost, probably speaks well of the odds of that effort being adopted.
Yeah, to your point of BlackRock and these folks entering in, it's a double-edged sword because a ton of capital is going to come in. They can set up a lot of infrastructure, but then again, they may just try to, uh, take it over, mess with it, and try to change things, right? Take away a lot of the values around Bitcoin. Hopefully they don't. Hopefully, look, maybe they become miners of Bitcoin, and I don't know. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, that's what would concern me the most.
Mm. Um, with that said, I want to ask you a question because you were on that advisory board with the SEC. And is this a symptom of multiple government agencies of like getting political, not following the law? Because I look at the SEC, they're supposed to have integrity, they're supposed to be protecting investors, they're taxpayer funded, they're supposed to serve the people. Yet we have all these things, judges saying they have no allegiance to the law. It's just so bad. And I'm like, man, how can an agency operate like this? And is it just, a bit of crony capitalism? They're beholden to TradFi and money and politics, things like that. Is just a larger symptom.
I think it is.
Mm.
These agencies, it's a sad irony that the worst problems in financial regulation are a result of financial intermediaries and the power that they enjoy. And these agencies, these regulatory agencies, are designed to regulate these big, powerful intermediaries. The financial crisis of 2008 was caused by big financial intermediaries regulated by these agencies, the SEC and the banking regulators.
Right.
And they failed to regulate them. Now a new technology comes up that can truly de-intermediate finance, that can empower the individual at its best, at its optimal. Now, not every project, maybe many projects don't live up to that ideal, certainly. But there's this technology offers the possibility of de-intermediating finance. And now these agencies see de-intermediation and they say, oh no, it's scary. This is too. Now, never mind that the entire history of these agencies is dealing with the problems caused by intermediated finance.
Right.
Now that it's de-intermediating, they've created a hammer to deal with this one nail. And they think, oh, I don't know how to hit that with this hammer. Let's stop it. Let's kill it. Let's just light it all on fire and kill it. That instinct is there. And it's fed by ignorance of the technology among politicians, some politicians. Now, there's some people at the agency that are actually smarter and that actually want to do what's right. I've interacted with people even at the Department of Justice, which historically is pretty aggressively anti-crypto. I've interacted with people at the Department of Justice that and at the Department of the Treasury that are really smart on the tech and trying to get their colleagues in the agency to learn more about it and differentiate between bad actors and good actors, and not ban entire technologies. But at the financial regulators, I think this bias toward intermediated finance that's heavily regulated and then has moats around it, partly moats created by regulatory barriers. It's just a bias that they see the world as always being that way, and they can't think of a world that doesn't exist that way. And I think this is true of this. I mean, this was true of Jay Clayton. I think he was a good faith guy. I think he generally was pro-market, and yet when he looks at this technology, and he was done some helpful things, right? His agency mostly got the Coinbase S1 through, and we got the some of the framework stuff on decentralization. But ultimately, the Ripple case was a bad case. It always was a bad case from the beginning, and he could have done more in the post-ICO era to go after scammy IPOs, but still create a framework where people could do airdrops and legit offerings of decentralized projects. But he didn't do that. And I think part of that was just skepticism of, well, there's always going to be a Goldman Sachs. There's always going to be a JP Morgan. And they're always going to be the primary mode of financing the economy. I think that's a bias that folks from that generation and who worked on Wall Street have, worked at the SEC have. I don't believe that's true. I don't think that will always be the case. It'll take time, but in a couple of decades, we'll look back and say that's no longer true.
Yeah, and that's the history of the world, right? And disruption and new tech, and it's hard for many of the incumbents to accept and swallow that pill. Like, well, no, we're getting disrupted. And examples of Blockbuster and many more, right? But adapt or die. And I think the disruption's happening. They don't like it. They're fighting back. Some are trying to, integrate crypto, but I don't know if that model is going to last, like you're saying,
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, with the United States here, we're still trying to figure out regulations, a lot of headwinds, of course, from these agencies. The rest of the world is all of a sudden trying to lure our companies overseas, and they're passing regulations, MiCA, EU, MiCA, UK. What are your thoughts? Do we lose some ground here?
Yeah, it's a legit concern. There are so many reasons why, if you were going to be a blockchain developer, if you're going to work in the United States, you got to find a way to do it anonymously. You have to build anon. That's the only way to do it. That's the only way it's possible. There's no way to comply with all the laws if you don't do that. Hopefully, technology allows projects to build remotely, which means they don't exist in any one country. And hopefully we can try to develop jurisdictional constraints such that so a lawyer for a government agency will tell you that everything has to exist in a country, and that country's enforcement agencies get power over it. And by the way, U.S. jurisdiction extends everywhere. Like if it touches us at all, and they would even tell you that if an agency touches the blockchain in some way on its own, and just runs a node, then we have jurisdiction where our node exists, right? Crazy stuff like that. That kind of jurisdictional overreach just makes it so that it's even impossible to offshore, makes it that it's impossible to build outside of the reach of the jurisdiction of the United States. I would pay more attention to that. I don't think there's enough attention paid to that among people trying to reform law to make it possible to build. Look, Henry Thompson's a good bill, but you know where we should be spending more time? The Federal Rules of Civil Procedure and the Federal Criminal Code, to look at jurisdiction that the U.S. has in bringing enforcement actions and making it clear that just because something exists on a blockchain that it interacts with the node and the node happens in the United States, that doesn't mean that exists in the United States.
Right.
And making it clear that just because you write down a copy of your private key in a country, it doesn't mean the coins on that key associated with a key exist in that country. Because I think those assumptions are ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. So JW, yesterday WorldCoin launched. When is your appointment to go get your eyes scanned?
Yeah, I'm gonna hold my hands over my eyes as we talk to make sure that nobody is using the look. I'm very skeptical of this project. I think Vitalik writes up a good critique of this project. First of all, they say, don't worry about privacy. Your biometric data is secure. Unless you are open source, I will never believe your assertion about that. Unless you're free and open source software fully, don't tell me that. I don't believe it. I'm going to assume it's a lie. And every crypto user should assume that that is a lie, unless it's open source. So I don't have any way to believe that you're keeping that information private. Not you, Tony, but WorldCoin. I'm talking to WorldCoin right now. I have no way to know that that's private, so I don't believe that assertion. Secondly, I think that if this project takes off, then the result will be that people are going to find a way to cheat it, and they're going to say, okay, let's go to developing countries, let's get people to register, and then I mean it's not gonna eliminate like bot spam on chain, because the bot operators will just pay people for their identity in developing countries where it makes sense to sell your identity to some bot spammer who's willing to pay you for it.
Yep.
I mean, that's a lot of the future of this project.
Yeah, that's a big flaw right there. And it's funny, I was tweeting this morning about in Minority Report, Tom Cruise has his eyes changed, right? What happens when technology gets to that point where I can do that, right? Just imagine what the black market for that.
I hate everything about that project. And yeah, it's not irrelevant too that look, Sam Altman has an interesting technology in OpenAI, but we've already seen how he operates. We've seen him bias the protocol. We've seen him advocate for regulation of AI to build a moat for his project. We've seen him move from a nonprofit to explore AI to suddenly, wait, this is a for-profit company. I'm going to sell some licenses to Microsoft, right? He is. I just don't trust him.
Yeah, this thing seems interesting. Like, I'm gonna go see the orb just to see it in person. I'm not gonna scan my eyes and make sure I wear sunglasses and everything.
Yeah, do that. Don't get too close to the orb.
Yeah. Final question here. I know if you're an advisor to the Zcash folks.
I sit on the board of the Zcash Foundation. Yes.
Got it. What's the latest with Zcash? Oh yeah.
Yeah, well, we got a lot of exciting projects in Zcash going on right now. So we have implemented trustless setup. So the cryptography behind Zcash doesn't require trusted setup. So that's helped to enhance our security guarantees for the Orchard pool of Zcash. We have coming online multi-sig capability. So that's going to help us in a lot of different building things on top of Zcash blockchain. The future of Zcash, I think, and a lot of folks are pushing for Zcash shielded assets. So the idea would be maybe you appreciate the shielding technology of Zcash, and it is the best shielding technology available anywhere in crypto. Maybe you're a Bitcoiner, or you're into Ethereum, or whatever. You're not a Zcash maxi, but you like the shielding tech. So maybe you want to shield whatever else it is that you own with Bridget or Rapid, or it's kind of an analogy to bridging and wrapping, though it's its own thing as I understand. But a firm called Kedit is building this out. ZSAs, you bring your BTC or ETH or USDC or whatever, it gets added to ZSAs, and you shield it, and then you later take it out of that pool, and it's unconnected to what you put in to the pool. I think that's really going to make Zcash useful to the rest of the crypto community. It's going to make Zcash useful to DeFi. We're also working on programmability to build DeFi applications on top of the Zcash blockchain, which is going to be cool. Wow. That's a lot further in the future. But yeah, I'm really excited for this technology. We also have a halvening coming up, which always, you know what halvenings do.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And lots going on. We have the big conference this summer coming up in I think it's in a week. Now it's this weekend. Matter of fact, the ZCon 4 is our fourth big worldwide conference of Zcashers and people coming over all over the world. Our ambassadors program has grown a lot of real world usage of Zcash in Africa and South America. And there's a few, I don't want to get too specific, but we've got some good stories of people who are touching stories of people who are using Zcash to send value to families that are in totalitarian regimes and help them survive. So Zcash is a humanitarian project, ultimately. That's why I'm interested in it. And it's succeeding in that goal. And it's just a fun group to be around. I mean, people like Zuko and the team at ZF, these were OG Bitcoiners and Cypherpunk on the Cypherpunk mailing list who were like, Bitcoin's cool, but it's not private enough. Let's build something along. So Satoshi at one point was like, I want to add privacy to Bitcoin, but I don't know how to do it. So they're the ones living up to that vision, and just to be able to hang around with this crew is it's infectious, you know. So it's a lot of fun to work on that project.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, those are great updates. I know I think I've asked you this before, and I'm a big proponent of privacy and you know, things like Zcash and so forth. I know though the governments, they have their targets set on anything privacy related with crypto, especially like in the United States. Now, in developing countries and in other parts of the world, it might really be beneficial and helpful. But what do you think governments, I think at some point they may try to stop these projects like Zcash. I don't think they can, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the risk is FinCEN will try to put some kind of onus on wallet software providers to do KYC. That's probably the biggest threat right now. That doesn't mean it would kill Zcash. Probably what it means is that you have a KYC wallet and then you have a non-KYC wallet. And then you have to transfer over to your non-KYC wallet or something. I don't know. But I don't think they can impose KYC obligations on individuals running their own wallet. I mean, the Bank Secrecy Act doesn't give the government that power at all. It's about having banks do surveillance for you, basically. So that's a risk, is imposing obligations on private wallets. The travel rule in Europe requires exchanges to ask customers about the wallet they're sending to from the exchange, which is fine. I mean, you can still use Zcash in Europe. At some point, a few exchanges in Europe were like, no, we got to delist Zcash. We had to talk with them, and then they were like, oh, okay, we're going to relist Zcash. Never mind. We can list Zcash under the new rules. Everything's fine, which is great.
Right, yeah.
And you can comply with these rules for exchanges and still have security in your own private wallet. So we have capability to do shielding by default in wallets, so that you send to an address that then within your wallet automatically puts it into a shielded address, receives in a transparent address, but puts it straight into shielded, so that you're complying with the exchanges, complying with their rules, but you're still maintaining private security for full privacy for your own wallet and your own holdings in your wallet. So for now, we're okay. There's always the risk of something. There's the Warren Marshall bill that thankfully is not going anywhere. Doesn't have legs. That would kill not just privacy crypto, but it would destroy Bitcoin. It would eliminate Bitcoin. Wow. Because Bitcoin has even the capability to be mixed, capability to be private. It would be banned under the Warren Marshall bill, which is crazy. It would destroy the government's own billion-dollar holdings in crypto that they've seized from. Which is wild, right? So there's always the risk of those bills. We keep an eye on them. I'm hopeful FinCEN doesn't do anything crazy to try to limit your ability to use your own self-hosted wallet. Self-hosted wallet is the name they give it. I just say wallet. It's just your wallet.
Right.
But so we're tracking all of that. But for now, you can get Zcash on every major exchange in the United States. And you should. And even some exchanges, I think Gemini will allow you to transfer, do shielded transfers in and out of Gemini. So yeah, I think Zcash is the best shielding technology available, and urge everybody to, we don't say hodl, we say zodl. So zodl your Zec.
Awesome. JW, always great chatting with you, man. I appreciate your insights. Thank you for joining me.
Good to be here.